The very first and biggest mistake I see investors make, and believe me, it's not just the beginners, it's people who have 20, 30, 40 properties, is putting properties in their personal name. I would never put an investment property in your personal name for legal purposes, liability purposes, other than your homestead. But I'm saying investment properties now, do not put them in your personal name. That subjects you to personal liability if something happens. And probably most of your audience understands the concept, but if you were to put that property in an LLC, or in Florida where I am, in a land trust, and we're the only state that has the land trust protection where it limits your liability. No other state in the union does, but we do. If someone slips and falls in that property, they cannot sue you personally. They can only sue the entity. So if you have only one property in there, they can only come after the equity in that property. If you own it in your personal name, they can wipe you out everything. They can garnish your wages. They can come after your bank accounts. They can come after every property you own. So very, very, very simple thing to do. Very simple thing to do, but you'd be surprised how many investors don't do it.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. And do you recommend just a typical LLC, or do you recommend somebody set up a series LLC if they're going to consistently buy more properties?
I wish we had series LLCs in Florida. We don't. Texas does. I know some of the states do. I would definitely do a series LLC if I could here in Florida. I'm waiting for the legislature to pass it. We are pushing for it. It's definitely a more efficient landscape. It's definitely a more efficient way to do things. I think it's the future. I think it just makes so much sense. The biggest pushback I get from people when I tell them my spiel about just putting it in a company's name or an LLC is like, well, I got 10 properties. I have to do 10 LLCs and 10 bank accounts and 10 returns. And, technically if you want maximum protection, yeah, but I also understand there's the practical aspect of it too. So you don't have to do 1-to-1 if you don't want to, but you definitely shouldn't do 1 in 10, right? Like 100% of your basket, your eggs in one basket. So I think the series LLC alleviates a lot of those concerns. So yeah, I think that's a phenomenal way to do it.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah. I've heard a lot of people recently have recommended that as well. And I think it would have made my life a lot easier too if I had started with that.
Absolutely.
One of the conflicting answers that I get is to this question. If I ask a couple different attorneys, they'll give me different answers. But what state it sounds like you would recommend forming in the state where you live or invest.
No, Wyoming.
Okay. Wyoming. Okay.
Wyoming.
All right. So
Wyoming.
So could you potentially do a series in Wyoming then and still buy Florida properties through that series?
The problem is this. The problem is this. You have to, when it comes to doing business in the state that you're in, like, so we'll just use Florida because that's my state. If you're going to do business in Florida, and there's a whole definition of what doing business is, but owning real estate is doing business here. You have to register that company here. So, if you register a Wyoming or a Delaware LLC, Nevada LLC, whatever state you pick, you still technically have to register that LLC in Florida if it's going to own property here. And by registering it in Florida, you still got to provide the same information publicly on SunBiz, which is our database here for LLC information, as you would if you formed an LLC here. Now, there are still other benefits, but the point is it's not anonymous if you create anonymous LLC and then register it in Florida. Now, that's why I recommend land trusts. Land trusts for me are the best way to hold real estate. It's definitely not a one size fits all, but in Florida, it's the best way to hold real estate for most of my investors. And, the more assets you have, the more complicated we can make it and the more complex we make it. But if you're just holding a few properties, you have, 3, 4, 5, 10 properties. I mean, it doesn't have to be that complex. I mean, we start creating holding companies. We start adding layers to it, but we don't need to do that up front. You don't need to be scared about what those terms mean. It's not that scary. It's actually, to protect you. But you don't, once you get to a certain level, then you have other things you're worried about. Right. So then we take those considerations, into effect and kind of custom make a plan for you.
Got it. Okay. So just so I'm clear then, initially you would form an LLC in Wyoming that's an anonymous, you wouldn't be able to see who owns that because it's a Wyoming LLC, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And then that owns land trusts, multiple land trusts in Florida, if you were investing in Florida, that
Yep.
would own multiple land trusts in Florida, or if it's another state that doesn't have land trusts, LLCs locally in that state.
Yeah, you still want to use the Wyoming one because there's charging order protection. And for those who don't know what that means, it's essentially that the if you were to get sued, it limits what the creditors can come after. So you can, if you set it up properly with an attorney who knows what they're doing, they'll set it up so that they can't just go grab your shares, or they can't force you to pull money out of that LLC and give it to them. It's only when you make distributions, which you don't have to make if you're set up properly. So Wyoming has statutory charging order protections, which like Florida, for example, does not. So you can manually add that in your LLC, but that could be contested versus Wyoming. It can't be contested. It's inherent in every LLC. So even though it's not anonymous when you register in a different state, there are still benefits to having the Wyoming LLC as the holding company. So in any event, I think that's a good first step. Even if you have to register and sacrifice some anonymity, that's still better than not having the asset protection aspect of it.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. And for a lot of people like me, and I just talked to another member of my program last week, actually, and several other members are in this boat too. But they've been purchasing properties and have several rentals, and maybe in multiple states or all in one state, but they didn't set it up this way initially. They just sort of formed an LLC and started buying, whether it was in the state that they live in or a different state. So at that point, once somebody has a structure in place, do you recommend starting over with a new structure, or what's your advice around that?
It really depends on how exposed they are at the moment.
Okay.
So, I mean, there's really a lot of factors, but I'll kind of keep it simple for the sake of this conversation. So, first of all, if you have things in your personal name, absolutely, there's no two ways about it. We need to get that out, right? Investments. Um, number one, especially if they're risky investments like short-term rentals, like apartment complexes, things where there's a high possibility of liability. If you just have like a piece of land, a small $30,000 piece of land out in the middle of the woods, maybe your liability is lesser. But in any event, that's one consideration. How is it being held currently, and what is the assets, or what is the real estate? Um, and then, number two, we want to look at, how big is the portfolio? What are you trying to do? And then financing is a big part of it, right? So if you're going to refinance, a lot of times we always have to take that into account in terms of how the structure, because lenders prefer certain types of entities over other entities. And we can always move those things around. But at the end of the day, we just want to be cognizant of that. So whenever I have a client who asks me, should I restructure? I always want to know about the financing aspect of it. The taxes, if you set it up right, that could be pretty fluid. Meaning, we can have some of the holding companies as pass-through entities, the same thing with the land trust. So you have flexibility with the taxes. And then the other consideration that I would bring up is the like you said, I said the financing, the type of property it is, and then once it's too late, it's too late, right? So don't come to me after you've been sued and there's a judgment against you and you want to move properties around, because I get that call sometimes. I say, there comes a certain point where you're not allowed to do that by the court order. So you can't call me then. So my point is, you do this stuff up front.
Mm-hmm.
It saves you a lot of money and time and effort and hassle on the back end. It's like estate planning, right? Like estate planning, you think it's expensive now. I promise you, it's going to be a lot more expensive if you don't plan your estate properly. So it's the same thing with asset protection. If you don't plan if you don't protect your assets good up front, you're going to have issues, potentially going to have issues on the back end. So, people come to me like, oh, we don't have any issues yet, we've never been sued. And I'm like, thank you. Like, you're coming to me at the perfect time. If you had been sued, it might have been a much more difficult situation.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And part of the reason, when I talk to a lot of people who have assets in their personal name, part of the reason goes back to the financing, because like a lot of people will talk about how you can get up to 10 conventional loans, investment loans before with Fannie and Freddie before you get cut off. And so conventional loans, it's very difficult to do those in an LLC. It's primarily they're done in your personal name. So if you have a bunch that are owned in your personal name and they're financed with a conventional loan, could you move those into an LLC, or since the financing's in your personal name, does that pierce the corporate veil, or are you still protected after the fact?
Yeah. So the issue with transferring from your personal name into an LLC is that technically it could invoke the due on sale clause in the mortgage that you have or the note that you have. There is an exception in the Garn St. Germain Act of 1980, which was implemented in order to encourage U.S. citizens to, start estate planning. So what it says is if you move your, real estate from your personal name into a revocable trust of any kind, which a land trust is revocable, then the lender cannot invoke the due on sale clause. And so that's another reason why I like land trusts. I think they're the best way to go. Now, understanding not every state has land trusts. But again, I mean, I practice in Florida. So for me, it's the easiest and the most sensible solution to most of my clients' needs, and it doesn't trigger the due on sale. In other states, I won't give you advice in other states, but I do see that a lot where you move it into an LLC. You just have to understand that if the lender lends you at 3 or 4%, and now rates are, they're coming down a little bit, but when they were at 7 or 8, might they call the loan due? They could, get that extra 3 or 4 points out of someone else. So you think it may not happen. It could. I've seen it happen. I have stories for you.
Interesting. Yeah. And I've gotten conflicting advice around that too. So I appreciate you bringing that fact up, because that's really, all of a sudden due on sale clause would be a nightmare if all of a sudden your loans are all coming due. So,
Yep.
Another question I had was around balance when it comes to how involved, I guess, you should get with an attorney early on. I've talked to people who are just getting started who, it feels like they spent 6 months trying to identify the perfect attorney and the perfect entity structure. And they've set up 1,000 different entities that all own each other. And then you ask them how many deals they've done, and it's, they don't have any assets, but they've spent tens of thousands of dollars on this intricate anonymous deal structure, and so there's that side of the spectrum, but then there's also the side that's I'm just going to go out and start buying stuff in my personal name and not even think about legal structure. So what's the right balance that you recommend?
Both extreme situations, what you just described. I couldn't imagine taking tens of thousands of dollars from a client who didn't own real estate for real estate related services.
It's amazing.
That's kind of funny. And then the other guy that you described as the extreme that I'm kind of, so you need to be somewhere in the middle. Look, the reality of it is, do you need an attorney to close your first residential deal, like your first, non-commercial deal? You probably don't need one. I'm not saying don't get one, but the money is, you're probably more sensitive to the cost and the price because you're just getting started, presumably. Mm-hmm. And in that case, I would tell you, if there's something that you're worried about or nervous about, sure. But if it's just a kind of a run of the mill deal, you have a senior investor that is kind of showing you the ropes, maybe you're JVing with somebody, maybe you don't need one. But I think as you progress in your life cycle of being an investor, it becomes more valuable because you run into more situations. If you're managing your own assets, you need a good good lease agreement. Obviously, if they're long-term rentals, if they're short-term rentals, you need to be aware of certain things. I'll give you some free tips here on the short-term rental game. You need to have a very strong waiver and hold harmless, a very strong one. If you're going to buy properties for short-term rentals, you need to be aware of what the local ordinances are, what the local city or county allows and doesn't allow. you need to be aware if it's an HOA, in an HOA, which are very prevalent here in Florida, which are getting a lot of pushback right now. Finally, people are waking up to how awful these HOAs can be.
Yeah.
But if you're buying a property in an HOA, this is just my personal opinion, it's probably not a good investment property, but it can be potentially. In any event, if you're doing a short-term rental, make sure the bylaws allow for you to rent for a day or a week or a month, right? A lot of times they have minimum requirements, right? So it could be 30 days, 60 days, a year, whatever. I'm just telling you all this to say there's a lot of things that go into it that you may not ever even know, think about, and an attorney can help you set yourself up for success with those things. I would never let a client of mine have a short-term rental property without having an extremely strong waiver and indemnification and hold harmless, and make everybody sign it. And oh my God, I had a client who had a pool and they didn't have one, and everyone went there and partied and got drunk, and someone busted their head open in the pool, and guess who got sued? And he wasn't my client before then, and he didn't have a waiver, and so that was not a good situation for him. But any of my clients, if you're renting a bike on the Airbnb, if you let them rent bikes at your Airbnb, or if you have a swing at your Airbnb, those are all really serious risks. People go there and they're drinking and they're partying and they're carefree.
Yeah.
I'm diving a little deep into it, but to step back and answer your question, it's always a good idea to have an attorney, but understanding there's a balance between when you're starting, maybe try to get a couple deals under your belt if you don't want to pay an attorney up front. But absolutely, as you progress through the cycle of being an investor, I mean, if you can afford to do it up front, I highly recommend it. If you don't feel like you are, I would just do it early on in the process as possible.